Greetings and welcome back to our study in Mark's Gospel. Today we are in Mark 14, verse 27 through 52. This passage starts out with Jesus and his disciples walking toward the Mount of Olives, towards the Garden of Gethsemane. And Jesus is explaining to the disciples a little bit of what he thinks is going to happen and what proves to actually happen later that night. He talks about how um, the the Old Testament talks of striking the sheep or striking the shepherd and the sheep scatter, and how he's applying this to his own life. And it is important to notice that when Jesus uses verses like this and from the Old Testament in a new context, he is not saying that that is exactly what that verse meant. Rather, he's giving the verse new meaning. He's giving that phrase new meaning. It has its original meaning in its original context that he is referencing, but he is providing it with a different, fuller, richer meaning. In other words, it can take on a secondary function. So in this way, that verse is not prophetic, as in it only pointed towards Jesus, and it was when Jesus said this that the verse actually had meaning. No, it is prophetic in the sense that it had a meaning for its time, and Jesus was able to reapply it to his own time and situation. So he is walking through with his disciples, talking about how he is going to be taken from them and that they're all going to desert him. And Peter, being Peter, gives Jesus this response of, no, that's never going to happen. I'm never going to allow that to happen. I'm going to stay with you even if others desert. I'm going to your fate, whatever your fate is. I'm going to be by your side. Jesus responds with the famous passage that Peter will deny him, and Mark is the only gospel that records this detail, that the rooster will crow twice before Peter denies Jesus 3 times. Every other gospel simply says that the rooster will crow before you deny me 3 times, or you will deny me 3 times before the rooster crows twice, or before the rooster crows. Mark adds in twice. So when we see later in this passage Peter reflecting on the second crow of the rooster, that's unique to Mark. It is possible, and it is potentially even likely, that since this traditionally has been Peter's story written down by Mark, that's how Christian tradition has understood Mark's gospel, that was um, Peter was the one who was giving Mark these details about Jesus's life and ministry. It is very possible that that is a true detail, because something like that would have been etched on Peter more so than the other disciples, since it was actually spoken to Peter. He is the one who hears Jesus's words directed towards him, that he, above everybody else, is going to betray. Not only is he going to desert with everybody else, but Peter will literally deny that he knows Jesus. So when Peter has the opportunity to back up his claim that he will be stalwart and faithful, he fails miserably. That would have burned itself very deeply on Peter's consciousness, because Jesus had told him exactly what was going to happen. And it is possible that Mark includes a detail that nobody else does, because it is more authentic. But Jesus goes to the Garden of Gethsemane. It is almost exactly like chapter 9, where Jesus leaves most of the disciples in one place, takes Peter, James, and John further into the garden, further into this secret location where he leaves them, and then he goes just a little bit further to pray. Now, here we're not told what the disciples who are on the outside did. We don't know. It's likely at this point that Judas kind of leaves the group, or he maybe wandered off on the way, knowing exactly where Jesus is going to go. John's gospel does say that Jesus dismissed him during the dinner, and that is possible too, but Mark doesn't say. He kind of implies that Judas is with them. And again, these are kind of details are the kinds of details that we would expect to be fuzzy. Where was Judas at exactly which time? That is a detail that you would expect to grow fuzzy over the years because people aren't going to care so much about Judas. Mark seems very glad to get him out of the story and brings him back only because he has to. The details about Judas in Mark's gospel are very scant, implying that Mark does not want to talk about the man who betrayed Jesus. He just wants to leave that in the past and move on. But Jesus takes his three innermost, the ones who had witnessed the transfiguration, up the mountain with him into the garden. And again, here we think about mount and garden. These are symbolic as well as historical details. Symbolism of going up on the mountain, we've seen it time and again. We saw it in the Mount of Transfiguration, where that is a place where God dwells. The same with a garden. That is the place where God dwelled in the beginning at the Garden of Eden. Jesus is going deep into God's presence to pray. Now, we are not told very much about Jesus's prayer here. The implication is that the disciples fell asleep and so did not hear everything that Jesus was praying, but we're not told. We're not sure. We're given the general gist of the prayer and the fact that these guys would have had a big meal, 4 glasses of wine, and it's late. We can understand why they would have fallen asleep. However, we also have to recognize that Mark is trying to say to us that the 3 who were taken into the garden, who were given the special privilege of seeing Jesus' prayer life up close, they were unusually weak. The idea that Jesus comes back to them and wakes them up and scolds them a little bit is meant to show us, one, the idea that Jesus is meant to face this alone because humanity is weak, but it's also meant to kind of highlight that the disciples, as much as they've done right over the last few chapters, there's still an element of them that they don't quite understand what's going on. They don't understand the significance, and they're not putting in as much effort as maybe they should to unite with Jesus in prayer. This idea that Jesus's last effort on earth is going to be in prayer shows us just how important Jesus's prayer life was to him and how much it mattered to him, because he goes into the garden specifically to pray. And it is important to notice that Jesus here is not simply saying, here's what I want, and then God says no, and then he just goes, oh, okay, and then walks away. It is Jesus wrestling with the idea of, God, what do you want? Here is where I think we're at, but I could be wrong, and coming to the conclusion that, oh, this is what God has for me. I really don't want to suffer, but at the same time, now is the time. And Jesus not simply saying, here's what I want, God says no, that's it. It's Jesus wrestling in prayer until he understands exactly where God is leading him and what he is supposed to be doing and how this is going to play out. It's a line for us. It's a way for us to understand the purpose of prayer. Prayer is not simply about saying, hey, God, I want X, Y, Z, and then God says yes or no, and then you kind of go along with whatever that is and just accept it. It is about working with God to understand what is happening in the world. Jesus is not simply pleading again and again, here's what I want, and then, oh, you're not going to give it to me, so I'm resigning myself to my fate. It is Jesus trying to understand where God is going and trying to get on the same page with God. And it's at that point that Jesus does get on the same page, that Judas and the soldiers from the the chief priests from the temple leadership show up. And here we have an interesting exchange, because Jesus is he confronts them saying, am I some sort of we usually translate it bandit or some sort of criminal, but this is a revolutionary. Am I some sort of revolutionary? Am I some sort of anarchist? Am I some sort of um, freedom fighter that you're going to come at me with swords and clubs? Is this military response necessary to arrest me? And that is an important stance or important idea for us, that Jesus is saying to us as much as he is to the temple authorities, who am I? How do I accomplish my mission? Do I accomplish my mission as a revolutionary, as an anarchist, as somebody who's trying just to simply bring down society by any means necessary? Is that who I am? And the rhetorical question for us is meant to be answered no, but it's something to wrestle with, because we see one of Jesus's disciples tries to use violence. He tries to use the revolutionary tactics and attacks this band of soldiers come to arrest Jesus. Now, two things are important to note. Number one, Jesus is distanced from this individual because Mark does not name him. John will say that it is Peter, but Mark doesn't name him. He wants to provide as much distance between Jesus and this action as possible, because Mark doesn't want us to see that the inner circle felt it necessary to take up arms. Mark wants us to just think, oh, this person is somebody on the outside who didn't quite get what Jesus was about. Now, John has his own ways of doing things, but Mark wants us to wrestle with how far Jesus steps away from that kind of violent conduct. Instead of embracing it, instead of utilizing it or even acknowledging it as a proper response and saying, hey, we can't fight this battle because we're going to lose it, Jesus distances himself and heals the ear of the man who was attacked. So Jesus pushes as far away from that kind of revolutionary behavior as is possible in this passage. Now, that is important for us as we wrestle with who Jesus is and what he's about, because it provides us, as Mark is wanting to do, it provides us with a line of thought for us as we interact with the world and interact with the soldiers around us. Think about when Mark was writing. He's writing in a time, probably in Rome, right after there was some violence between Jews and Christians that led to the expulsion of all Jews in Rome. The Jews have just returned, and there's still some animosity. He's also writing on the eve of, and maybe during, the Jewish revolt of AD 70. So he is seeing firsthand where revolution is taking people and where this kind of violent conflict is taking people. So when he's saying this, he is writing against that backdrop, and means for his audience, his first audience, to think about Jesus's response to the temple guards as their response to the Roman authorities. He wants them to think about that and pursue that in their lives and how they are working towards their own goals of following Jesus. The last thing in this is Jesus is taken away. He's led away by the temple guards, but we are told about one young man. This is verse 52. It's how this section is going to end. One young man who's wearing nothing but a linen robe, and he is grabbed by the robe and he squirms out of it and runs away naked. Some in the church have always seen that linen robe, that white linen robe, was typical outfit for somebody who was being baptized. And so there's been a tradition, a liturgical tradition in the church, to see that one individual as representing all disciples who would come after, who would be baptized into Jesus's movement. You and I deserting Jesus in his time of need, as the baptized community. That's us. There's also a tradition that says that that boy was Mark, who is actually writing the book, and that Mark, while he did not have access to most of this story, he had tagged along a little bit behind Jesus and his company. And so when the officers came to arrest Jesus, he was there, and one of them grabbed him, and he was able to squirm out and run away. But this is him writing himself into the narrative to show that, hey, I at least saw this 5 minutes of action, and you can believe this. That's been a commonly held tradition throughout the history of the church, and it doesn't have a lot of textual or historical support other than that's been the tradition passed down from fairly early on. So it shows us that all of the disciples ran away, and Jesus is about to go before the court and plead his case. So until we meet again, God bless. If you have any questions or comments, as always, I would love to hear what you are learning in this text, and drop them to me so we can discuss them together. And have a great day.